So for discussion 6, what we're looking for, or what I'm looking for, is your decision making. Now that you've gone through this course and you've learned so many different facets of operations management, if you were running a team or a group, and you had about 6 teams, and each team functioned differently, and they went ahead and were able to take care of a certain amount of customers, how would you make decisions? Now, granted, this is just looking at a very simple problem from a labor productivity perspective. And if you recall from chapter 2, labor productivity, you would just take the outcome. In this case, it's the number of customers that have been handled by your crew. Divide that by the number of team members, and then look at your data and see which would be the best decision you should make with the information you have. Now, from a data perspective, you have some information, but you don't have a complete picture. So sometimes it's very difficult to make just black and white decisions if you were to look at just the labor productivity, because that's one facet of it. But the other part of it, and this question that you're in, question number 6, it's not necessarily that there's a right or wrong answer. It's more about your thought process. How do you go about making decisions based on the information that you've covered all semester long? So one of the things that you want to definitely do is decide, well, first of all, what is the decision you're trying to make? What are you trying to decide? Is it deciding on the number of people, the optimum number of customers you want processed? Because really, the way the business is structured matters quite a bit. So for example, if you had a lot of customers already in process, but you had more employees than or little employees, and for example, if you had 2 employees and they averaged about 20 or 25 customers, as opposed to when you had teams of 7 and they only managed to cover each about 13, you might want to dig deep and see what was the issue. Why was it that a team of 2 was much more productive than a team of 7 or 5? Now, if you're looking at just total output and from a cost perspective, it doesn't really matter how many employees you have, which is doubtful. But sometimes companies will set up their organizations from a commission base. So the ultimate number of customers processed is much more important than the number of people. But again, it depends. So part of this process for discussion 6 is look at the information you have, look at the information you might be missing, and how would you approach it? Would you go back and look at what made one team much more successful than the other? Would you just do it based on labor productivity? I mean, again, discussion 6 doesn't give you a lot of background information on how to solve this problem per se. It's more about your critical thinking capacity and how would you go about approaching that problem, and what other factors would you look at, and what would be some of the recommendations. So for example, some of the recommendations would go along the lines of looking at each of the different teams, what made them successful, what didn't make them successful. You would also want to capture some additional data as to, for example, you would want to find out what the variable cost is so that you can look at it from that perspective. Does it cost you more per customer acquisition? Do you make more profit the more customers you process? So maybe the first couple of customers doesn't cost you the same. It really depends. You also want to think about maybe break-even costs. Now, granted, you don't have the cost, but how else or what other things would you want to consider before making a recommendation or consideration in your final decision of what to do? You know, part of it could be that you decide that the larger teams aren't beneficial, that you've seen much more productivity from a smaller team. And if so, why would that be? Part of it could be just the dynamics of everyone focusing or trying to get a customer. I'm sure many of you have gone to the malls, for example, when you have all the cosmetic people, well, in the past, right? All the cosmetic people vying for your business and they're all spraying you, so there's a lot of competition. So therefore, from a productivity standpoint, it might be difficult to get a high number per person because there's just so much competition. Then again, with small number of folks or a small number of teams, the problem with that is that they can only process so many at so many times, so they're going to be capped out at a certain number. So part of this process is, again, for you to think about it, look for some data points that you might want to consider, some other things you might want to consider from a decision point. So what is it? What other information would you need as an operations manager to figure out and solve this problem. So when you approach discussion 6, think about it from that perspective. I want to see what your thought patterns are, what you're looking to, how you would go about solving this problem, and then again, some recommendations that you would make based on that information or limited information that you have. And of course, don't forget to calculate the productivity levels for each one of the weeks based on the number of teams and the number of customers you have. So one of the first things you want to do is figure out what decision is it that you're trying to make. Then you want to go ahead and gather the data and then look for alternatives. You want to make sure that you understand those alternatives and what are some of the consequences of making certain decisions. This is where the whole analysis piece comes in, and understanding your data and understanding your customers and also your market segment. Then you want to go ahead and make a decision. You want to go ahead and pick one of the alternatives, the best one that makes sense. And then after that, you want to go ahead and measure, because you can't, how do you know you're successful unless you're able to measure? So you really need to understand what it is you're measuring, how to put those systems in place to gather that information, and then at what key points are you going to measure to know whether you're successful or not. So for example, for this particular problem, if you decide that smaller teams are much more productive in general, and you decide that you want to have 4 people on deck to go ahead and process the accounts or the customers, then you want to go ahead and measure and see, well, how many customers came in, how many customers ended up having to wait, how many customers actually got processed, and see whether or not it makes sense. You also want to look at seasonality. So these are some of the things, so for discussion 6, that you would want to add as things that you would, how you approach it and how you would measure success, the different systems you would put in place. So think of this as an exercise, again, in your critical thought process on how you would approach a problem, what would be some of the steps that you would put in to know that you're successful, and then what would you do if you're not successful? If it turns out that you're better off with a team of 7, because a team of 7, when you have an influx of customers, can process more customers and at the end of the day become much more productive than a team of 2 that at some point have a massive capacity. Again, things to consider and things to put down for your responses. Go back through your book and look at chapter 5 that talks a lot about strategic planning and decision making to get some ideas from that perspective, and then look at how, again, you would put in some systems in place to measure your success. Look at your data again, try to figure out what it is that you're trying to do. I know this sounds very difficult to grasp to a certain extent because it's relative, it's theoretical. This problem is very theoretical. Like I said in the beginning of this lecture, there's no right or wrong, it's theoretical. You have a problem, very limited data, but how you approach it. So think about it more so from the decision-making process, which is also included in discussion 6, the model for decision-making, and utilize that as a catalyst to start thinking about the problem and then coming up with solutions on how you would go about solving the issues.